Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's broadcast. If you enjoy the Thomas Jefferson Hour, you can support the show by going to jeffersonhour.com, and we encourage you to sign up for the 1776 Club as a way to support the show, or however you'd like to. And if you're unable to or not wanting to do that, write us a letter. Let us know what you think. Ask President Jefferson a question. That's the kind of support we appreciate as well.
Or do both.
Yes.
We love your letters, especially your letters questioning or challenging or urging us to take on a topic. It's good when you disagree with us, even better if you agree. That means we're probably right. But you never know.
I wanted to note that you're back from your Steinbeck cultural tour, and I understand it went very well.
Extremely successful. It was just very nearly perfect. Point Lobos, Fremont Peak, Doc's lab, Ed Rickett's lab at the heart of Cannery Row, the aquarium, which has a beautiful Steinbeck and Ed Rickett's exhibit about the canning industry and about Doc's work. All hail to Russ and Liz Eagle.
Oh, yes, of course.
The camp hosts who were tremendous. And Russ is a Steinbeck lover and a Steinbeck scholar and added dramatically to the success.
You couldn't really do it without his input, could you?
Wouldn't want to.
Well, speaking of Steinbeck, my favorite reader, my wife Jan, is into her third volume of reading Steinbeck. I think she's reading Grapes of Wrath right now, but I wanted to take a personal
one
moment.
of the greatest of all American books.
Yeah, and you have talked about how that's really relevant.
Just let me take 1 minute.
Yeah.
I read it, I've read it 20 times maybe, each time with a different lens. Great books greatly renew themselves every time you read them. This time I read it without even planning to, through the lens of borders and refugees and migrants, because it's a migrant story. It's a story about an Oklahoma family that joins a phalanx of migrants who are moving to California seeking the American dream. And I'll tell you what, I wanted to write our situation over and over and over again. And what Steinbeck basically says is two things. One is humans are humans. That people who migrate in the way that people have been doing from Central America into the United States or from Syria into Europe are not doing this because they're filled with wanderlust. They do this because their worlds are desperate and they have no other option but to pick up and go somewhere else where there's a chance that their children are going to live in security and have adequate food and a pair of tennis shoes. That this is not some sort of a invasion or some sort of game or trick or gaming the system or whatever. These are human migrations that are touched off from time to time when the world gets destabilized, and that we must look on them as human situations. That's number one. Number two, I'll say this carefully. In 1936, while this was happening, if there had been Fox News, Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck would have been on the California-Arizona border saying, turn them back, turn them back, turn them back. The same attitude we see today with respect to refugees from Syria or refugees from Central American countries existed then, and we would expect the same types of people, not in my backyard, I'm here, you're on your own, America first, California first, me first. That same group of people was involved in the world of the Grapes of Wrath, and it just struck me and horrified me to think that we have learned so little about the nature of human desperation. So I urge everyone. I'm always pushing books. If you read all the books that I push, people would have very little else to do in their lives. But great books get at the heart of life. Steinbeck says a great book is trying to get at some impossible question that you can't quite wrestle to the ground, can't quite articulate, but that's what a great book tries to do. And this is a great book about what happens when circumstances get so bad that people get up and go hundreds of miles into an uncertain world in hopes of a slightly better life for themselves and their children and grandchildren. So Steinbeck and Russ and Liz were great. All the people were great. We had no fundamental problems. It did rain on Fremont Peak, but that added to the romance of the thing.
Well, great. And I know you have some dates that you'll be announcing here shortly for the next round of cultural tours. Again, next week we look forward to interviewing Peter Stark about his book, Young Washington. But right now, let's go to the show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. But seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson, and it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, citizen.
It's such a wonderful time of year. We have spring in the air, and I'm certain the gardens are getting ready to flourish at Monticello. We do have an issue with time change, which I think Mr. Franklin had some comments on, but those who decide these things have decided that at one point of the year we should spring our clocks ahead an hour, and at another time of the year we should set them back. Have you ever heard of such a thing, Mr. Jefferson?
Well, Dr. Franklin was a pragmatist, and he was constantly trying to eke out a little bit more productivity from the day. So primitive societies go to sleep at dusk and wake up at dawn and use very little artificial light. As we grow more advanced and industrialized, we artificially extend the day with candles and whale oil lamps and so on. And Franklin was always trying to figure out a way for us to take most advantage of the natural light of the world, which is, of course, the light that the Creator has given us. So these thoughts were discussed during my time. I'm more of an absolutist. I believe that Greenwich, which is the center of the world's time, and 0 degrees longitude should set the tone for this, and that we should be mathematically precise and constant and regular and orderly as we extend time across the planet. Otherwise, all you have is local noon. There's local noon everywhere. There's local sunrise everywhere. There's local sunset everywhere. And historically, that's how societies have operated. But in a more advanced world, time becomes something of an abstraction, and we try to adhere to it more closely.
It's a bit inconvenient in my time. All of our body clocks have to sort of readjust. I understand using natural daylight, but not that it's an issue you should concern yourself with, sir.
Well, indeed. But I will say this, I never wasted a single moment. And I don't think there couldn't have been 2 or 3 times in my life before my final illness in 1826 when I was asleep if there were light in the world. In other words, from the moment that the first light came in the morning, I sprang up, and I tended to go to sleep pretty soon after the light had disappeared in the evening, but I never wasted, in my recollection at least, a single moment of daylight in the whole course of my life.
Well, then the takeaway, sir, must be no matter what the clock says, use your time wisely.
Efficiency is everything.
I was hoping this week, Mr. Jefferson, that we could talk about a gentleman that you've spoken to me about before, someone I know you had a great deal of respect for, and that would be George Washington.
Washington will be remembered and admired as long as there are lovers of liberty in the world. Washington was a man of extraordinary integrity, and he saved this country twice. First, in the war, a long, difficult, frustrating, in many respects, tedious war for which we were never adequately prepared. And Washington soon came to understand this, that there was no easy way for us to win a battle in a European-style battle against Great Britain, the most powerful country in the world. And so knowing that, he realized that our chief duty was to win when we could, to have a series of annoying skirmishes that would frustrate the British ministry and the British Army and Navy, and outlast Great Britain, that at some point Britain would despair of being able to hold the American colonies within her bosom at so great a distance, 3,000 miles of ocean. So that was his first great achievement. And then he also proved to be an exemplary president, the first, and therefore the most important, because so much in the Constitution is unwritten. It had to be invented carefully as a set of protocols and procedures and manners, and Washington did that and retired. He wanted to retire after a single term. He certainly retired after 2 terms, and in doing so proved to be really a refutation of the historical view that people who lead nations in revolution almost automatically installed themselves as dictators. He had none of that spirit.
I'm thinking of Mr. Washington as a young man. I'm not even certain, Mr. Jefferson, when you met him first.
I met him at the House of Burgesses. I met him in Williamsburg. So at that time, Williamsburg was a tiny little colonial capital, and I had been elected to the House of Burgesses. I had also studied at the College of William and Mary and then studied in Williamsburg with the great George Wythe, my law preceptor and the greatest self-taught classicist in the New World. And so I spent a lot of time from about the age of 17 until about the age of 25 in the capital. And it was not only the political capital of Virginia, but it was the cultural capital. It was a bit like London in the 18th century in Britain. It had its season. While the House of Burgesses was in session, the great planters and anyone else with public business to do or with an active social ambition would come to Williamsburg for plays and balls and masks and horse racing and a range of other entertainments. So I met Washington in the House of Burgesses, but he was already famous to me. By the time I met him, he's considerably older than I am. By the time I met him, I knew of him because he had fought in the French and Indian War. He had been out in the Ohio country on behalf of Governor Dinwiddie and had fought valiantly, had written a journal which was published, and it helped to establish his fame. And so I looked up to him as a kind of a Virginia hero, as a military hero, as a dashing, young, military, I won't say genius, but a military hero. This all before I ever met him. So he had already had a life. He had already built a life of hardship and some heroics by the time he became something of a statesman. He was never a very active legislator. He was the quietest of all members of the House of Burgesses. He spoke very occasionally, but privately at dinners, in taverns, over tea or coffee. He would quietly state his views, and his views were always taken more seriously than those of almost anybody else. But he was never, in the whole course of his life, an active legislator.
You began your description of Mr. Washington talking about how he accomplished things during the Revolution and his leadership. It would seem to me, from what I've read, Mr. President, that his young life, this time in the Ohio Valley and his adventures, he was barely in his 20s, prepared him for what he had to do during the Revolution, and he wasn't very successful when he was in his 20s.
No, but he was up against almost impossible odds, and these really would follow him for the rest of his career.
Impossible odds?
Yes, so the supply lines from Williamsburg or Alexandria to the forks of the Ohio, to what's now Pittsburgh, were long, through almost trackless wilderness, the cutting of trees, the removal of stones, the building of makeshift log bridges across the streams often swollen in flood, these immense supply lines over some of the most rugged territory in the world, unprecedented really since the time of the Roman Empire. And then you have the problem of lack of funds, that the government in London and the colonial government in Williamsburg never provided the funds that were really needed, or the soldiers, or the horses, or the wagons, or the fodder, or the uniforms, or the rifles, or the ammunition, or the food. And so Washington is trying to do what a great young republic does, but without the wherewithal to do it adequately. And his frustrations were extraordinarily large through this entire period. The fact that he persevered is one mark of his mastery.
These efforts were a failure, and yet he became somewhat of a hero.
Yes, because he was dashing, and because of that journal, and because reports were that he was the best of a fairly mediocre lot. One of the problems was that the British regarded us as rubes and yokels and barbarians, and so they didn't ever credit young men of talent like Washington. He wanted a commission in the British Armed Forces and virtually begged for it. He certainly deserved it. They wouldn't give it to him. He wanted command. They would not permit him to lead troops usually. He was constantly trying to maintain his reputation and self-respect against the snubs and the condescension and the demonization of the British regulars and the British officer corps and Parliament and the British court. So he was really up against some nearly impossible odds. And then when he actually fought, it has to be said, I don't mean to be critical of a great man, but he did not fight very wisely early on at the Battle of Fort Necessity or any of the other early skirmishes. He was heroic in Braddock's defeat out at the forks of the Ohio at Fort Duquesne, but he was not a great leader. In other words, he didn't lead to victory. He just made the best of a bad situation and showed more physical courage than most of the other officers and men around him.
It was his first real time of trying to achieve things in a diplomatic way. He was dealing with the French.
The French had been on this continent for a long time. They had the Louisiana Territory down near New Orleans, and they had Quebec and Montreal and the Canadian territories. And both Britain and France laid claim to the Ohio Valley. And we Americans, who were British subjects, were determined not to let the French hem us in or to build their own colonial empire in the area across the Appalachian Mountains in the heart of the Ohio Valley. So that's really the basis for the long struggle that's known historically as the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War.
And Mr. Washington had interests in the Ohio Valley.
Yes, the Ohio Land Company. There were two companies, the Loyal Land Company and the Ohio Land Company in Virginia and Pennsylvania and other colonies had these interests out in the West. He was a shareholder in the Ohio Company, and Dinwiddie was also. So they were fighting a war partly of geopolitical implications, but partly to secure their own land speculation.
There's a great deal of interesting information you're sharing about Mr. Washington. We appreciate that, Mr. Jefferson.
You are welcome, sir.
Right now, we're going to take a short break, but we'll continue this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, inviting you to be part of the Thomas Jefferson Hour Book Club. As you know, we are looking somewhat formally at a number of books this year, and the next on the list is Jefferson's only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia. It was an answer to a set of questionnaires, but Jefferson turned it into an American classic, kind of encyclopedia/almanac/love song to his Virginia, which extended at that time all the way from the Atlantic at least to the Rocky Mountains and maybe beyond. So Notes on the State of Virginia. You can join us by sending in your comments or your questions or your thoughts, but we need them by April 15th so that we can include them in the book club program on Notes on the State of Virginia. Go to our website, jeffersonhour.com, and you'll find all the details. But let us know what you think about Jefferson's only published book, the classic Notes on the State of Virginia. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And this week we're speaking with Mr. Jefferson about, well, young George Washington so far. You had said when we left the conversation that Washington did have an interest in the Ohio Valley. It would seem from my reading, sir, that as a young man he learned the art of surveying and recognized the value of the lands that he was surveying and began to buy sections. In fact, my understanding is that at one point he actually worked with your father, Peter Jefferson, as a surveyor.
That is true. My father was a surveyor. I was a surveyor. Washington came from how shall I put this, from a somewhat lower social strain than I did, and I was only in the middling area of the planter aristocracy of Virginia. But Washington, in some respects, was a self-made man. His father died when he was 11. His older brother died when Washington was a very young man. He was fiercely ambitious. He wanted to be part of the planter aristocracy, and that meant land. You could not be a smallholder and be part of the landed aristocracy of the colony and later Commonwealth of Virginia. So he thirsted for this, and one way to do this was to distinguish yourself in war, which he did, and then to be rewarded with land grants in the West. And when he had a little money, he never had much at this point, never had much until he married Martha Custis, one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia. But when he had a little money, he bought shares in the Ohio Land Company and was a great promoter of that. But I don't want it to seem to all of you that he was engaged in some sort of conflict of interest, or that he was using emoluments to further his own wealth and station. Yes, he was fiercely ambitious. Yes, like almost everybody else, he speculated in Western lands. But I don't think that's why he was out there during that period between 1752 and 1763. He was there as a patriot and as someone who was seeking military glory. I mean, there's no question that he was you would say, a young military adventurer seeking military glory and fiercely working for it. That was much more important to him at that point than land wealth in the Ohio Valley. I should say, before we go on, that I had the chance many times in my life to speculate in Western lands, and I never did so, and here's why. I knew that at some point I might be a legislator setting policy for the lands of the Trans-Appalachian region, and I never wanted to be in a position to be accused of a conflict of interest. Whatever I decided as a governor or member of the House of Burgesses, later House of Delegates, or a national officer of any sort, I wanted to be able to make my views known from a kind of moral and political purity, and I knew that land speculation almost inevitably can lead at least to the appearance of conflict of interest.
But surveying as a profession was a good profession for a young man such as Washington. And I'm certain that it was a revelation to him to find out how difficult living in the wilderness was.
I wouldn't have been able to do it. I was a surveyor, but I surveyed quite close to home. I don't have that kind of a physical constitution. If you read these accounts, there's a famous incident in which he was taking messages out to the French in an early example of Ohio River diplomacy, and he was taking a raft with another man across a swollen creek and fell in. And the water would have been 33 degrees or so, with ice flows everywhere. He might have drowned. He was wearing heavy boots and moccasins and so on, but he lived. But I would not have had the physical capacity to hold up under such conditions of sometimes near starvation, living in fear of wolves or Indian attack, prolonged exposure to below zero temperatures, walking through mud and sleet and snow, being rained on, being tipped into swollen rivers very nearly at the freezing point, a long way from anything that smacked of civil life or comfort. He had this capacity, especially as a young man, and almost superhuman strength and perseverance and stamina, which is one reason why he became the great leader that he was, that in some sense, leading a nation in war is about physical stamina as much as it is about the intellectual qualities or political qualities of administration or leadership. So he was a surveyor, and this was a way to make a mark. He began by surveying the great northern holdings of the Fairfax family, and that was an entree to a glittering social life for him in the northern neck of Virginia. And it also was this is a vital enterprise in a state like Virginia. We were a few 100,000 people, maybe 400,000 people, most of whom were on the great rivers or near tidewater or near the Chesapeake. And so here was this land to the west, almost infinite in scope. No tree had ever been cut down. No piece of ground had ever been plowed. No gold or silver or lead mine had ever been opened, not even a salt mine. And so this was what you would call a virgin wilderness. And the first thing you have to do is measure it. You have to go in and make maps. That's what I asked Lewis and Clark to do. And then if you're going to deed it out, if you're going to put actual yeoman farmers on that land, you need to divide it into townships and sections and acreage, a quarter section, a half section, whatever it turns out to be. And so in my time, that was done by someone called a surveyor. And the surveyor took out a theodolite and a group of chains and rods and found a starting point, and then measured with these chains distances using a compass, and that then created the grid of acreage which could then be sold or speculated upon or granted to war veterans or whatever it might be. But nothing happens until, people can go out and squat, and they always do. No matter what you do, there will be people who are the Daniel Boones of the world who will get ahead of civilization, will go out into the wilderness, and without surveying anything, they'll just find a nice spot and take it. Then when the surveyors come, you have to either indemnify that, you have to accept it and work around it, regularize it to the point that you can, or you have to eject those squatters from the land. I'm always on the side of the squatters as against the land speculators, but it creates some disorder when you eventually come in and try to do a rational geometric survey of this place. So this was one of the most important professions in a frontier society.
Earlier, Mr. Jefferson, you said that Mr. Washington had this accident in
the stream.
Yes, and nearly died.
He could have died. He had just a tremendous physical constitution, fortunately.
Which begs the question, had he died, was there anyone that could have filled his position during the Revolution?
You're asking the wrong person. If John Adams were here, he'd say, well, of course. Washington was a great man, but there are many great men, and we make men great. Some men are born great, some men achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them, said Shakespeare in his play Twelfth Night. And Adams would say Washington was made great by circumstance and by the Continental Congress, of which John Adams was a key member. Adams was the person who proposed Washington as the commander-in-chief, wanting a Virginian in that role. But he later came to believe, Adams did, that Washington was overrated and that a mythology had sprung up around him. And
really?
Yes. Adams was quite grumpy.
Now, how do you know that?
I know this from correspondence, from the letters that Adams wrote to me between 1812 and 1826, and he made it clear that he thought Washington was overrated, Franklin was overrated, and guess who? I was also overrated, according to Mr. Adams.
Where did Mr. Adams put himself on that scale?
Underrated, vastly underrated, dramatically, pathetically underrated. But
poor Mr. Adams.
But his point would be, leaving aside his envy and his whatever those passions are in Adams, he believed that George Washington was one of a number of people who might have served us very well during the Revolution, and that we should not regard him as the indispensable man. I do, however. I believe that Washington was perfect. He was probably not the greatest general who ever lived. He was no Napoleon. He was no Julius Caesar. But he learned on his feet.
He inspired his men, too, did he not?
With his character, with his carriage. He had perfect posture. He was the greatest horseman of his age, in my opinion. His judgment was sound. He was not an intellectual. But and slow to make up his mind. But when he did, his judgment was very nearly perfect. He endured hardships. He was fair, stern, but fair to the men. He worked hard he felt their suffering. He worked hard to relieve it. he was a gifted leader of men and an inspiring one for all the reasons that I've stated and more. And so he won a lot of loyalty. But I believe that his greatness consists of his capacity to be flexible and to realize, as he did after the debacle of New York in 1776, when the British very nearly won the war by bottling him up, first on Long Island and then on Manhattan Island. He learned an important lesson. A, it was going to be a very long war. B, we would never win in a pitched battle with the British. That our only hope was to be opportunistic, to take what chances we could to strike them in skirmishes, and then to elude them, avoid a battle to end all battles, and outlast them. And this was not his character. His impulse was to fight. He wanted to fight and fight in a big way, but he realized you can't win that war. You can only win in a war of attrition and, to a certain extent, a guerrilla war, and that was how we were going to achieve our independence. And so I give him enormous credit for that. And furthermore, you've heard me say this before, but when he resigned his commission and returned to private life at Mount Vernon upon the successful completion of the war, he did what nobody expected. Historically, this usually leads to Bonaparte. This usually leads to Julius and then Augustus Caesar. There are almost no instances in the history of the world when a great military commander in a time of revolution or crisis voluntarily resigns his commission and returns to private life. This almost inevitably leads to dictatorship and tyranny. If you read your Plutarch, you find this. If you read the history of the Roman Empire, you find this. If you read even the history of the British Empire, you find this. And so here was the true Cincinnatus, a man who was virtuous beyond personal ambition.
You talked about George Washington after the Revolution becoming president, and you became his Secretary of State. And I've always had a little difficulty with balancing your admiration for President Washington and some of the things you did that were disagreeable to him, and in fact, resigning as Secretary of State. Could you justify that for me, sir?
I was serving as the American minister in France. I came home on a leave of absence. I intended to go back. I had left most of my personal effects there and my papers. When I got here, there was a letter waiting for me from the new president, George Washington, saying that he had not only nominated me to be Secretary of State, but the Senate had already confirmed that. I thought of declining his generous offer, but Mr. Madison said to me, "No, you have to accept this. When George Washington and the new president of the United States calls you to duty, you have no real choice. You must accept." So I did. I didn't really wish to, but Washington assured me that I could resign when I needed to and that the duties would not be onerous. I got to the new capital in New York and later to Philadelphia and discovered that the duties were onerous. The Secretary of State had a huge portfolio. He was, in a sense, the prime minister, in a certain limited sense. And secondly, I discovered that Colonel Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a fiercely ambitious man, and that he was really swallowing up the portfolios of the other cabinet ministers. I don't like political conflict. Frankly, I don't like Hamilton, and I really dislike Hamilton's vision of this country. But here's the problem. Hamilton had served as aide-de-camp to George Washington during the war. He regarded Washington as a kind of a father figure. Washington, who had no children of his own, regarded Hamilton as a sort of son. Hamilton was tireless in his ability to do hard work, write memos, engage in the arts of lobbying and persuasion.
But so were you, sir.
I was not tireless. I didn't have I never had quite that ambition. My point is that Hamilton won most of the battles in the cabinet of the Washington administration. I felt increasingly useless. I was still an ardent, small r Republican, very limited government, very limited taxation, very limited military, state authority wherever possible. And I saw that Hamilton was a nationalist and a militarist and a believer in centralization and broad construction of the Constitution and banks and stocks and you name it, a mixed and maybe proto-industrial economy. And I discovered that Washington, even though he was instinctively, I think, in my world, seeing the world through my vision, our shared vision, but practically, Washington almost always sided with Hamilton. And so when I realized this, I felt that I could do no good for that administration. I was frequently at odds with its policies, and I felt that I was somewhat disloyal and sometimes behaved in a somewhat disloyal way. And so I felt the better part of wisdom was to retire to Monticello, and eventually in early 1794 I did.
Excuse me. So, Mr. Jefferson, you're telling me that you resigned from Washington's administration because of lack of self-worth or
lack of persuasiveness.
And this is what made you leave?
Yes, I don't like conflict. I know it may sound self-serving, but I literally get headaches and digestive problems in conflict. I couldn't really abide Hamilton's distortion of the American possibility. I was really saddened that Washington was more often sided with Hamilton than with, I think, the better interests of this country. And I will say, frankly, I believe that in his second term, Washington had the beginnings of, I suppose you'd call it, senility, and that he was being led by the nose by this unscrupulous Secretary of the Treasury from the Caribbean.
Were there any things that you accomplished as Secretary of State that you were proud of, sir?
Yes. I helped to keep us from steering too close to Britain in our foreign policy. I reminded us that France had been our ally during the war, that we probably would not have won so soon, or maybe at all, if it hadn't been for the help of the French. And I made sure that Hamilton was not able to thrust the French off the table on behalf of his real love, which was Great Britain.
Well, sir, I am sorry for the troubles you suffered during that time of your life, but I do thank you for your service.
I retired, thank you very much. I went back to Monticello, and my goodness, the house and the farms needed enormous amounts of attention.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Mr. Jefferson. I feel as if I understand Washington's place during the Revolution a bit better now.
You're most welcome, sir.
Right now, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson between these segments of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, inviting you to join me in the Outer Banks for a series of public humanities programs. This is one of my favorite things to do, a couple of characters in a couple of days. This time, Monday, March 25th, Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Tuesday, March 26th, Sir Walter Raleigh, the man who named Virginia, and who sent the lost colony to Roanoke. And third, my one-man program about Shakespeare called Shakespeare, the Magic of the Word. That's Wednesday, March 27th, all on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, the Don and Catherine Bryan Cultural Series. For tickets and more information, you can go to bryanculturalseries.org. There's also a Jefferson Hour dinner at a great restaurant called Coastal Provisions. That's Thursday, March 28th. And for tickets and more information about that, coastalprovisionsmarket.com. But all of this at the Thomas Jefferson Hour website, jeffersonhour.com. We'll see you in the Outer Banks, Meriwether Lewis, Shakespeare, and the man who created Virginia, Sir Walter Raleigh. Thanks. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. This week we talked with Mr. Thomas Jefferson about the young George Washington, and David, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
That would be me.
By the way, somebody at the Steinbeck retreat cultural tour that I just did, they all greeted you, of course, and wondered whether you existed, but and urged you to come on these adventures, and I tried to explain. But one of them said that she objected to semi-permanent guest host. She said, how about temporary permanent host? I said, I'll put that to David. I'll put that to David. She said, temporary permanent host.
I hate to come off as too strident or locked in my ways, but The day I am no longer the semi-permanent guest host, maybe the day I'm not sure what.
Noted. I'll use that power if it's ever required. This program on the young Washington is an anticipation of an interview that we are about to do with Mr. Peter Stark.
He'll be on next week, correct?
He wrote Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. He had previously written a book called Astoria about the aftermath of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
I'm familiar with that. I thought this was a real fun book. I mean, I don't want it taken the wrong way, but I mean, parts of it read like a movie script. It's just a great story.
Peter Stark, Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. He lives in Missoula, Montana. I've actually been on the Missouri River with his son, who's one of Wayne Fairchild's river rats on the summer tour. And so this is going to be a pleasure. But I'll tell you, so we talked about Jefferson's understanding of Washington. And normally when we talk about this, it's about the later things, Jefferson's time as Secretary of State and the contest between Hamilton and Jefferson for Washington's approval and Jefferson v. Hamilton. But we spent most of our time in this program talking about how Washington became Washington. And this book by Peter Stark really gets at that. I'll tell you my impressions before we actually interview Mr. Stark next week. Number one, young Washington was not very successful, a point you made on this show, that he actually had a pretty rough French and Indian War. And Peter Stark says he touched off the French and Indian War, that
well, he really did.
he precipitated a world conflict. It might have come anyway.
It's not like there was malice intended. It was a series of events that sort of led to it. But he was in charge.
So then there's the debacle at Fort Necessity, where he had to surrender. But the most astonishing thing about this whole story is that when he gets back to Williamsburg, he's already a hero. I mean, not the fact that he had a pretty bad French and Indian War didn't hurt him at all. He became already a nationally and even internationally famous person based upon his physical and his physical courage and stamina and his heroics. So that really struck me. The other thing that really struck me about Peter Stark's book is what a clothes horse Washington was. He's constantly designing splendid new uniforms for himself and other officers. He really wanted to look the part of a colonial military leader and went to great length. And then third, his ambition. And this was a man of profound ambition. Jefferson, our man Jefferson, if he was a man of ambition, you'd never know it because he pretends that he's not. That's not Washington. Washington was a man of ambition. He intended to be one of the aristocrats, one of the great planters of Virginia. He did whatever it took to achieve that goal.
Yeah, something from the beginning of Peter Stark's book. He says, this is not the Washington of the cherry tree bedtime story. This young Washington is ambitious, temperamental, vain, thin-skinned, petulant, awkward, demanding, stubborn, annoying, hasty, and passionate. Get more adjectives in a sentence than that, would you, sir?
Yeah, and constantly threatening to resign. No matter what happens. If he doesn't get his way, or if he feels slighted, or if he feels that he's not being taken seriously enough, or that his reputation is being questioned, or that anyone is even looking at him cross-eyed, or that it might not be to his advantage to remain in the military, then he threatens resignation. And I actually came to feel sorry for poor Governor Dinwiddie back in Williamsburg, the colonial governor. He's got this brilliant young hothead who's just as touchy and as easily offended as it is possible to be. And Washington is bombarding Governor Dinwiddie with letter after memo after letter.
If they'd have had telephones during that time, he would have given standing orders to say, tell him I'm out.
And at least at 2 points in this book, Dinwiddie has had enough, and he writes very stern letters to young Washington saying,
thank goodness those letters have survived. They really give an insight.
Dinwiddie is basically saying is you can't treat authority the way you're treating authority and survive. The number one question I get when I talk about Washington out in the world was, oh yeah, wasn't he always in love with another man's wife?
Sally Fairfax, right. Yeah.
But it turns out there's a fair amount of evidence in this book that Washington had a kind of unrequited, he was smitten by Sally Fairfax, It's not that she led him along.
Well, he wrote that letter asking permission to have a correspondence as he went away to war, which is pretty telling, especially for the time.
And then 2 weeks, you didn't perhaps see this one today, but 2 weeks before he married Martha Custis, he wrote to Sally kind of a Hail Mary letter. Like, he wouldn't, he had to write in that kind of 18th century way. He couldn't say, here's how I feel about you. But he made it clear that she was the love of his life, that if somehow circumstances permitted it, that's what he would want, that no other woman was ever going, that kind of a letter, but written in such carefully coded 18th century language so that if her husband, his good friend, read the letter, he wouldn't fight a duel with him.
And Jefferson had a similar situation.
Yeah, they're all doing this in some ways.
Yeah.
None of this really bothers me except insofar as he's already proposed to and won the heart, or at least the marriage of Martha Custis, the wealthy widow. But it's clear that even on the eve of that, his heart is somewhere else. And so we don't normally think of George Washington as a man with much of a heart or a romance. We think of him as a very establishment, respectable, reliable, somewhat aloof, a deeply professionalized person. This book reveals him as a man of emotion and raw emotion. So I found that interesting. And almost everything I know about the French and Indian War I read in this book. Have you ever read? I don't know much about this.
I really enjoyed this book very much.
George Washington, the first president of the United States, the president of the Constitutional Convention, the commander-in-chief of America's efforts during the Revolutionary War, one of the wealthiest and most successful planters in America, had an interest in the West equal to Jefferson's, maybe more. It's Washington, great interest in the West, as you said, somewhat in perhaps conflict of interest. Adams, no interest in the West. Jefferson, enormous interest in the West. Madison, very little interest in the West. Monroe, very little interest in the West. So Jefferson and Washington are the two. And one area that Stark doesn't talk a lot about, David, but both Jefferson and Washington believed that the Potomac had to be the portal into the West, that there should be a Potomac Canal to the Great Lakes, and that if Virginia would build a Potomac, Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland would build a Potomac Canal, they could be the window, the portal into the vast wealth and commerce of the American interior. And Jefferson and Washington spent an enormous amount of time on this. It turns out, of course, that the Erie Canal, 1825, became the portal into the West. And look what happened. New York became New York, and Virginia languished. This was one of the key infrastructural decisions in American history. The fact is the Erie Canal was a better canal than the Potomac Canal would have been. Eventually there was a Potomac Canal, and it's never really worked very well. But both Jefferson and Washington were certain that the future of our national destiny lay beyond the Alleghenies, beyond the Appalachians, and they worked hard at it.
We've got a bunch of letters about Washington that have sort of gone unanswered. I thought I'd bring a couple to you, if that's all right, sir.
Of course.
One's from Alec Johnson, who listens on 88.9 KMPR in Minot, North Dakota. He writes, in multiple conversations, you've discussed Mr. Jefferson's admiration of President George Washington for leaving office after having served 2 terms, a move that not only set a precedent, but was the action of a man committed to ensuring the United States would not become a monarchical system as many became post-revolution. With that in mind, what might Mr. Jefferson say regarding Franklin Delano Roosevelt serving 3 full presidential terms and being elected to a 4th?
Well, Jefferson died in 1826, so he didn't live to see this. He thought that the precedent set by Washington and then followed up by himself, Adams was a 1-term president, would be essentially set in concrete. That the fact that the 2 of them, the first 2 popular presidents, limited themselves to 2 terms when they easily would have been reelected to a 3rd and 4th term. Jefferson believed that established the tradition and that nobody would dare to seek a 3rd term. So he was wrong. But of course, FDR was president during the greatest crisis in the country after the Civil War, not only the Depression, but the Dust Bowl, but also World War II. And so the nation felt with FDR at the helm that we had the right person there, and we shouldn't shake things up given the colossal, almost unbelievably large nature of the national and international crisis. But Jefferson would say, see, that's what I'm warning you about. Circumstances come, you reelect somebody to a third term and then to a fourth. What if Franklin had lived another 25 or 30 years? Would we have elected him to a fifth term? Well, probably not. But Jefferson worried about this. So after FDR left office, after he died, it didn't take long for Congress to pass the amendment forbidding third terms. And so this was a reaction. It was more, and I have to say, David, the reaction to FDR's third and fourth terms was more political than it was constitutional. In other words, a lot of this was Republican revenge against the New Deal and against FDR and Truman. Had the wartime president been Herbert Hoover, Congress may not have done that, but the Democrats coming to power probably would have tried to do it.
Sounds like the times we're living in, doesn't it? Yes,
there are almost no arguments that are not political. I mean, sometimes we like to wish that we lived in a kind of some sort of an idealistic republic where people did things because they actually had high principles and so on, core values. It's inevitably political, and there was so much FDR, so much FDR fatigue by 1945.
Well, that and the war.
The war wound down. It was time for a change. But you know what happened at Potsdam, the last of the great war councils. This was in Germany, near Berlin, in 1945. Truman went because FDR had just died, and Churchill went. And in the middle of Potsdam, Churchill was retired by the British people.
Right.
So he's the prime minister. He saved the world more than FDR did, but Churchill was more important for the winning of World War II than the United States. And the minute it was over, they retired him. There was Churchill fatigue.
Well, maybe it's just, the war's over, let's move on.
We want normalcy, and everyone got that Churchill was a problematic leader. That's not so much true of FDR, but everyone in Britain understood he might be the right man for this moment. His whole life might have led up to this moment. But there are many things that the British people did not like about Winston Churchill, and so he couldn't be a peacetime leader.
Another one here from Charles Schneider. He writes, in Richard Beeman's book, Our Lives, Our Fortunes, Our Sacred Honor, he mentions the Declaration of Taking Arms. It was to be a revised draft which was originally written by other delegates and was to be read to the troops by George Washington. After Jefferson wrote it, James Dickinson, who was a moderate, edited this version where many changes were made. Are you familiar with this?
That was earlier, so this is well before the Declaration of Independence. It was a declaration for the taking up of arms. Jefferson wrote a draft. Dickinson came in. Dickinson did this with Jefferson several times, where the young intellectual prodigy from Virginia is given a chance to draft something, and then Dickinson, who was a much more seasoned legislator, took over and then cleaned it up, chastened it, polished it. And Jefferson, of course, always had his feelings hurt. This is the way Jefferson was. But this was an earlier declaration to justify our war efforts after Lexington and Concord.
And Clay, before we end for this week and say goodbye, I'd like to take just a personal moment, if I might, to recognize my lovely wife, Jan. Jan has been a part of the Badlands Conservation Alliance for the past 20 years, starting as a volunteer and ending up as their executive director. She's retiring and stepping down from that position next month. And I am just in awe of the work she does. And I, like many North Dakotans, am so grateful for what she has done, looking out to protect the special places in western North Dakota and thinking about the future of our state. So I just wanted to recognize that and say thank you to her.
Let me say this much about that. Jefferson says that the price of being in a republic is eternal vigilance. And in my life, I've met a lot of people. I've never met anyone as vigilant as Jan Swenson, who's been the director of the Badlands Conservation Alliance. She's gone to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hearings, meetings, siting discussions, negotiations, these routine things that government has to do in the name of transparency, and they hope that nobody ever turns up. She goes and sits there on those folding metal chairs and listens to hour after hour after hour of complicated, tedious citing questions because somebody has to do it. And if she didn't do it, it wouldn't get done. And it is the most unsung work that you could possibly imagine.
Yep, it is.
And she does it with discipline and with passion. Her departure leaves a gap, not only in the Badlands Conservation Alliance, because I don't think anyone, frankly, could do what she's done, but secondly, it leaves a gap in North Dakota because we need a conservation ethos. In my opinion, the Badlands Conservation Alliance is as close as we have to the leader of such conservation ethos as we have, and Jan has been the center of all of that. And so let me say this, if she were here, she'd be frowning or maybe knocking our heads together.
Rolling her eyes.
Because she doesn't like to talk about it. But if people want to show respect to you or to your spouse, Jan, or conservation in North Dakota, they can send a small contribution to the Badlands Conservation Alliance. Let's put that link up on our website. It's important.
Will do. And
read all of Steinbeck now, Jan.
Yeah.
And then Dostoevsky.
Yes.
And then Tolstoy. And then Twain. And then Melville.
She would thank you.
And then Dickens. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.